Alright, welcome back everybody. This is now part 3, and in this part we're going to be talking about the work of Max Weber and Emil Durkheim, the two remaining figures in our big 3 figures at the founding of social science. Let's talk first of all about the work of Max Weber. Now, Max Weber was writing sometime after Marx. You can see his birth dates and death date there. Like Marx, he was German, and like Marx, he wouldn't really identify as a sociologist. He was known as a political economist, a legal scholar, a historian. Today we really would call him a sociologist, but Weber was hesitant to use that term. And I think that hesitancy came from what sociology meant during his lifetime. During his lifetime, sociology had a very strong positivist bent, and sociology was associated with this very hard-nosed scientific study of the world. And this was something that Weber really rejected. He believed that we should not use the same methods in the natural sciences and the social sciences. To some degree, he rejected the idea of a social science, right? He believed that the human sciences, like history and sociology, were very different from the natural sciences. In part, that was because he believed that people could respond to the claims that social science was making. People were not like rocks or chemicals, right? When a geologist has a theory about a rock, the rock does not respond. The rock does not push back. The rock cannot change its behavior on the basis of what academic theorists might say about it. But people can change their behavior. I think you actually see this in the work of Marx. And it's one of the challenges of Marx's theory. Marx wanted to predict the unfolding of human history, and he made a whole range of predictions about the end of capitalism and the emergence of communism. For example, one of his predictions was that a communist revolution would first happen in a very advanced industrial country, like England or Germany. Now, we know that's not what actually happened. What actually happened was there was a communist revolution, first of all, in Russia. Why was that? Well, in part it was because Marx wrote what he wrote and people read it. Figures like Lenin read Marx and they decided, you know what, let's give it a shot in Russia instead. So people can change their behavior on the basis of what we say about them, and that means that our work as social scientists is always going to be different from our work as a natural scientist. And this is exactly what Weber wanted to convey in his sense that sociology was a very different discipline to what these other disciplines like physics, chemistry, etc. So here's some of Weber's key questions. He is very interested in authority. Why do we follow certain people? Why do certain people have authority and status over us? He's interested in the role of ideas in social change. He rejects the Marxist idea that ideas simply flow from changes in the economy. He thinks sometimes ideas can actually determine what happens in the economy. Like Marx, he's interested in capitalism and the consequences of capitalism on human identity, human culture, things of this nature. And as I just talked about, he's very interested in the differences between the social sciences and physical sciences. And he wants to maintain a pretty clear border between those two things. Now, like Marx, Weber is a theorist of stratification. He's interested in authority, power, and so on. Now, when I use that term stratification, some of you might know what I mean by that. What I mean is that a system of stratification is a system that tries to put human beings into different categories and to arrange those categories hierarchically, so that being a member of a certain group gives you more status, more power, more authority, and so on. That's what we mean by stratification. And stratification can be done on the basis of many different dimensions. People can be stratified on the basis of class, on the basis of sex, racial groups, ethnic identities, sexual orientations, right? We know these are all sources of inequality and hierarchy in societies. Weber's key argument against Marx was Weber did not believe that economic wealth was the sole determinant of hierarchy and stratification in society. It was a very important one, but for Weber it was not the only one. So Weber spoke about the importance of class as a basis of social power. Yes, having more economic wealth gave one more power. But for Weber, again, this was not the only way that one could obtain power. One could also obtain power through what Weber called status. And status was honor, prestige. And this could come from a variety of dimensions. It could come from great achievements, like the Roman generals would have great achievements in the military field, and that would enable them to gain status in society. It could come from a noble birth, for example. It's not necessarily about economics here. It could be simply about this kind of prestige that comes from being attached to a certain family. The important thing for Weber is that class and status were independent. Right? Typically, a higher class meant a higher status, but in some cases, status could be independent of class. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Weber also spoke about the influence of party, and party was another way that one could gain power, and this is power that's based upon membership of certain political organizations. And what Weber means here is that individuals from lower class groups can obtain power by joining in to alliances with certain kinds of other groups in political parties. So a Marxist might say that the dominant political parties in society are just the mouthpiece of the upper classes. Weber would disagree with that. He would say that parties are more complicated social phenomenon. Parties have to appeal to a wide variety of interest groups across different classes. They can represent the interests of different classes, and they can be alliances between classes. We know, for example, it's not just that the more income you have, the more likely you are to vote for the Liberal Party, right? Or the lower income, the less likely you are to vote for them. We know that these political parties in Australia have very complex constellations of voters that come from vastly different class groups, and Weber was quite sensitive to that phenomenon. Let me talk more about this difference between status and class, because I think it's actually quite important, and I want to draw some examples from Weber's own work here. Weber was very interested in ancient Indian civilization, in the Vedic civilizations that existed some time ago. And one of the key features of those civilizations was a caste system. And the caste system still has massive ramifications in modern India. The caste system is a bit different to, say, a class system. When it comes to a class is something that determines one's life, but there is typically mobility between the classes. Some people can fall down from the upper class, some people can rise up to the upper class. With a caste system, that is not the case. You're born into a caste, and typically the individual is stuck in that caste. And in the Indian caste system, this determined many things about their life. It determined, for example, their occupation. So the highest caste, the one with the most status and prestige, was the Brahmin caste. And this was a caste that was full of priests and teachers, scholars, intellectuals. And it was actually the lower castes where you would find rulers, warriors, and where you'd also find occupations like traders and merchants. And the important thing is that in these lower castes, those occupations were often more highly paid than occupations in the highest caste. Many of the Brahmins, for example, were priests, and many of these priests had to take a vow of poverty, had to renounce their worldly goods. They were not allowed to actually amass economic capital. So here's a good example where the status hierarchy in society might not necessarily map on to the hierarchy of economic wealth. Here's another more contemporary case from Australian society. Think about the cashed-up bogan. Right? This is an individual who is stigmatized and stereotyped because they've obtained a lot of economic wealth. However, they don't have any status. Right? Typically because they're seen to have vulgar cultural taste. Right? They have money, but not taste. They have economic power and maybe class status, but not necessarily status in the Weberian sense. And this shows you again the difference between status and just economic class. This was one area where Weber disagreed with Marx, but there's many others we can talk about. One of the key areas that Weber disagreed with Marx is on the idea that economics should always be our priority when understanding the social world. Remember, Marx had this very strong idea of base and superstructure. It's the economic base, the economic forces in society that determine everything that happens in the society. It determines the culture, the values, the media, the art, the intellectual life, all that kind of stuff. This was something that Weber did not agree with. He believed that societies were more complicated than that the single causal explanation that only looked to the economy was always too simplistic. He wrote a very famous book to make this argument, and this is probably one of the most influential books of social science. It was called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Remember what Marx thought about religion. For Marx, religion is the opium of the masses. Religion simply justified the capitalist system. The economy would change, and religion would adapt to suit changes in the economy. Weber tried to point out in this book that sometimes it was actually the other way around. For Weber, we would not have modern capitalism if it wasn't for changes in religion that occurred in European societies through the 16th, the 17th, and the 18th century. So Weber is interested particularly in the Protestant Reformation, and he believes that the Protestant Reformation, right, the move from Catholicism to Protestantism in many European countries, paved the way for industrial capitalism. Now, if you don't know much about the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism, it can be hard to explain Weber's argument, but I'll give it a shot. One of the key differences is that in Catholicism we have a very strong focus on the monastic tradition. Right? There is a very strong belief that a virtuous, good individual is able to withdraw from the world, to become a monk or a nun, to live in a convent, for example. This was something that the Protestant reformers typically rejected. They didn't like this kind of differentiation between monks and lay people, or between priests even and lay people. They believed that the virtuous individual should find their calling in the world, to devote themselves to a worldly vocation, commit to that, and this is where the idea of the Protestant work ethic come from. They showed their virtue by working hard in their occupations. And this led them to amass very high amounts of capital. What then do you do with all this money that you've earned if you're a virtuous Protestant? You could spend it on yourself, but this would be seen as sinful and ostentatious, right? You couldn't buy luxury goods or something like that. The community would not accept that. Could you give it away? This is again where Protestantism started to diverge from Catholicism. Many of the Protestant movements in Europe discouraged charity. They believed that it would lead to indolence and idleness and laziness on behalf of the poor. It would rob them of the opportunity to have this work ethic. So you've got all this money, you can't spend it, you can't give it to other people. What do you do with it? Well, it's a very good vehicle for investment. So Weber believes that certain elements in Protestant religiosity encouraged investment on the part of the individual. And this created a kind of pool of funds that helped to kickstart the emergence of capitalism, the extension of capitalism, the push for markets to enter into all these different domains and to expand their reach across different countries. Now, Weber's argument here is not that changes in religion will always cause changes in the economy. He's simply trying to challenge the Marxist idea that first change happens in the economy and then it spreads out from there. Weber says, well, here's one case where change might have started in religion and then influenced what happens in the economy. There's some other interesting ideas that come out of Weber's work on the Protestant ethic. Weber thought that Protestantism gave us a new orientation towards life. That even those who weren't Protestant started to take on this orientation towards the world. And it's an orientation of rational calculation. Now, to explain this, I have to explain Weber's idea that human action can be driven by a variety of motivations. Some things we do simply on emotional reasons. And we do things because we enjoy them, or we do things to avoid states of pain or psychological distress or something like that. When we fall in love, for example, it's typically simply an emotional reaction to another person. There's also forms of action that are based upon tradition. So if you ask people why they do certain things, maybe why they dress in a certain way, or why they have certain customs or habits, they might say, well, it's traditional. It's always the way it's been done. It's the way my father did it, and the way his father before him did it. Weber thought that in early human societies, most of our action was driven by emotion and by tradition. And he thought that now that was being replaced by a new form of action, which was action that was based upon rational calculation. We choose a goal, and we determine what is the most effective and efficient way to achieve that goal. We say, forget about tradition, forget about the way things have been done. Let's figure out the best way to do this particular thing. We become obsessed with efficiency, calculation of that kind. And Weber thought this process of rationalization was spreading across human societies. He was very worried about it, in fact. He thought it would create, in his words, an iron cage of restrictiveness around us. It would reduce our human freedom, this obsession with efficiency. But he saw this process occurring across these different institutional spheres. This is a term in sociology that refers to different sectors of social life: the economy, politics, media, health, art, education, law, etc. All of these for Weber were becoming rationalized. Let me give you one quick example of this, which comes from the world of sport. Most sports have undergone a process of rationalization, and it's interesting to consider some sports which have not. Sumo wrestling is actually a really interesting example of this. If you look at how sumo wrestlers train today, you'll notice their training methods are almost identical to what they were 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and even before that. And if you ask sumo wrestlers, why do you train this way? They'll say, well, that's the way we've always trained. There's almost an expectation on sumo wrestlers that they train in a traditional way. To do anything else would be to violate the customs of sumo, and that's very important for Japanese culture and for these sumo wrestlers. Now, nowadays, I do see some sumo wrestlers doing things like weight training, in more modern, fancy gyms, things like that. But often they don't make a big deal out of it. They often hide it because it's not considered the right thing to do in some cases, even though it might be more effective. It might be a more effective way to get stronger, for example. But they often won't want to do that because they believe that what they should be doing is upholding the traditional customs of sumo culture. Compare that to a different kind of sport, Something like cycling, for example. You would never hear a cyclist say, well, why do you hold that certain posture on a bike? Well, that's the way we've always done it. No, every aspect of how they behave on the bike is studied and scrutinized and examined using scientific methodology. Right? Aerodynamics and tracking and all these kinds of things to determine the absolute perfect way to ride a bike. And so all cyclists have to conform themselves to that mentality because often they're trying to eke out these tiny gains in performance. Think about similar sports like car racing, for example, or Formula One. Right? These are hyper-rationalized sports where every decision that an individual makes is on the basis of efficiency, productivity, rational, scientific calculation. The difference is between, say, sumo on the one hand, cycling on the other. That's the difference between traditional and rational action. Now, something really interesting about Weber is that Weber also thought that authority was becoming rationalized. That is, if you ask people, why do you follow a certain kind of leader? Right? Why do you follow these particular rules? We can also talk about rationalization there. So Weber looks at many early forms of authority and he thinks they're mostly based upon emotion. Right? They're charismatic in nature. Sometimes we follow people simply because they have a kind of magnetism. Think of certain celebrities, for example, cult leaders, certain political figures. People's attraction towards them is not always rational. They have an ineffable quality that simply attracts us. That's charismatic authority. Some forms of authority are based upon traditional action. If you ask people, why do you follow the king or queen, for example, that might be charismatic in some cases, but it can also be the case that individuals simply feel, well, it's always been that way. We've always listened to these people and this family, so we'll continue to do that particular thing. Again, Weber thought that in modern societies, these older forms of authority were giving way, and what we were seeing was the emergence of a more rational form of authority. And this was a form of authority that was based around rules and regulations, systems, codified, right? Codes, systems written down that told people how to behave. If you ask me, for example, why am I presenting lectures in a certain way, why am I doing certain things on Canvas, the answer is probably going to be because university policy says that that's what I have to do. So we follow rules because that's what the rules say. We follow rules because we believe that they are rationally justifiable. We might look at a constitution, for example, and say, well, this seems like the best way to run an organized society, so that's why we will do things in that way. And this rationalization of authority was something very interesting to Weber. He was someone who was very fascinated by bureaucracy in particular. And bureaucracy is all about following the rules because they are the rules. Just to give you one quick example of this, you can think about how authority might have changed in, say, the Catholic Church. So we can think about the earliest figure here, Jesus Christ. This is a charismatic figure, right? Somebody who was not basing his authority on tradition, but on the basis of his charismatic appeal to a small group of followers. Eventually, in the Catholic Church at least, we see the emergence of, say, cardinals, we see the papacy, and individuals follow these authority figures because, well, it's traditional. For hundreds of years we've listened to these people, so we'll keep listening to these people. Eventually we also see the development of, say, systems of canon law, right? Books and guidelines and rules and regulations that all Catholics must abide by. And so here we see the transformation of authority from the charismatic figure to more traditional figures to now the rules themselves, rational legal forms of authority. Now, I just want to finish the section on Weber by talking about a few important ideas that we get from Weber. First of all, Weber disagrees with the structuralist stance of Marx. He does not believe that our purpose as sociologists is to find some universal fixed laws of human behavior. Weber thinks that we have agency as individuals. And again, we talk about structure and agency in sociology. And agency is about our individual free will, our individual free choices. For Weber, we have the ability to shape our societies. And a social science which didn't account for that was an impoverished social science. So for Weber, the goal of sociology was not what it was for someone like Marx. It wasn't to explain the world and to change the world, to predict future changes. Instead, Weber focused on understanding people, understanding people's points of view. He used a German word for this called Verstehen, and Verstehen simply means understanding. To have a sociology based upon Verstehen is to focus, again, not on predicting people's behavior, but on trying to empathetically understand their position, the meanings that they place on the world, the meanings they attribute to social phenomena. Weber wants us to focus on the individual's worldview, their intentions, their thoughts, their motivations. And he's far more interested in developing specific theories about specific cultures at specific times than developing some universal laws of history. And still many sociologists believe in that kind of approach. Some other influential ideas from Weber. He believed that sociology should be value neutral. Right? He wanted a strict separation between politics on the one hand and science on the other. He would have hated, for example, a lecturer who preached politics using some kind of scientific authority to defend certain political positions. He thought that these domains should be separate. Very different to Marx, for example. He believed we should avoid monocausal explanations. Right? There is always a temptation when we're explaining to society to say, oh, it's always this one thing. It's always the economy. Or it's always biology. It's always genetics. A Freudian might say, oh, it's always about your obsession with sex and sexuality. Weber says, no, society is more complicated. Everything, human action, social change, is determined by a very, very wide array of forces. We talked about his anti-positivist view of sociology, right? His idea that society and culture should not, for Weber, follow the template of the natural sciences, but should be different. And of course, we've talked about his interest in how patterns of authority can develop and change. Well, you can take a break there if you like, but let's just change tracks and we'll talk more now about Emile Durkheim, the last of our big figures. Now, Emile Durkheim was a Frenchman following in the tradition of Comte. He was heavily influenced by Comte, and unlike Weber, he is a positivist. He believes wholeheartedly in the positivist idea that sociology should be a science. He worked all his life to legitimize the idea that sociology could be a science. At a time when nobody really believed it was possible, Durkheim promoted sociology, he institutionalized sociology, and in fact he was the first professor of sociology in France. He really dug a very important trench for future figures, and we owe a big debt to Durkheim. Now, Durkheim's key questions are a bit different to those of Marx and Weber. Whereas those figures were focused on authority and conflict and power, Durkheim is more interested in the question of social integration. This is the question of why society hangs together. Why is there not conflict in society? What prevents aggression, war, social conflict, civil war? What prevents disintegration, the fragmenting of society? Like, why do we all get along? What holds us together in this one situation? So Durkheim was interested in the mechanisms that held us together. He was interested in how they changed throughout human history. He was interested in what motivates people to be members of society in the first place. Why don't we just drop out of society? Right? What motivates us to be productive, healthy, contributing members of the social group around us? And of course, he's interested in how our participation in social groups shapes our individual mind. Right? Durkheim believes that the individual consciousness is shaped, molded by their participation in a broader social group. And he was someone who focused on that very intensively. Remember I said that Durkheim is trying to justify sociology. He wanted to prove to everybody that sociology was necessary. And he made a lot of important arguments and wrote a lot of important works towards that particular end. One thing that he wanted to point out was that explanations of human behavior that only referred to, say, biology or psychology were not sufficient. They always left a piece out. They never explained human behavior fully. The example I like to give of this is, think of something like my voice. Right, I'm speaking to you right now, and there are various things that determine the nature of my voice. My biology determines the nature of my voice. Right? The fact that my vocal cords are a certain length, the fact that I'm male, the fact that I have a certain architecture of my mouth, my teeth, etc. That changes the nature of my voice. My psychology also changes my voice as well. Whether I'm a more timid person or a more confident person, etc. Things like the temperature in the room determine my voice as well, like geographic factors, for example. But is that everything? Is that all the factors that influence my voice? No. Think about culture. Right? The fact that I've been socialized in a certain way. The fact that I have an accent that shows that I'm a member of a particular culture. The fact that I'm speaking English, for example. The fact that I'm playing the social role of a lecturer. Like, I'm trying to be exciting, passionate, and hopefully you get that sense from this particular lecture. But would I necessarily be talking this way to a friend? Probably not. Okay, the social role that I'm playing is influencing the way that I'm speaking. So Durkheim wanted to point out that these social factors, like culture and socialization and interaction and social roles, have just as much of an influence on my behavior, and that you cannot explain human behavior without thinking about the role of social forces. He called these kind of forces social facts. And social facts were features of the social environment that could influence individual behavior and individual identity. And this might be a factor like culture and socialization. It could be something like population density, for example. Durkheim believed that the more population density occurring in society, the more the individual might feel under pressure to specialize their occupation, or the more anxiety they might feel living in a population of that kind. So again, a social factor that influences the individual. For Durkheim, this is a social fact. One of the most influential attempts to understand social facts was Durkheim's book on suicide. And this is a very interesting work. Again, one of the most famous works of early sociology. In this book, Durkheim tried to argue that suicide cannot be seen as just a psychological phenomenon. If you want to understand suicide, you cannot just focus on the individual feelings that are going on in the mind. You have to also focus on society and culture as well. Durkheim thinks there were factors in the culture that could lead to more or less suicide. And surely we know this now, right? Because we can look at different societies and we can say different societies have different suicide rates. Human psychology is very similar across the world, but culture changes, and culture can clearly influence the suicide rate. Durkheim noticed, for example, that someone being married meant they were less likely to commit suicide. Someone having children meant they were less likely to commit suicide. And one thing he noticed was that Catholic countries had less suicides than Protestant countries. Now, Durkheim tied all these facts together by arguing that social forces that tied the individual to society, societies where there was a very high degree of social integration, were often protective against suicide. What does marriage and children do for the individual? It commits them to society. It gives them, in a sense, something to live for. What did Catholicism do as opposed to Protestantism? Well, Catholicism was a more communal religion. It was more integrated into the community. There was a greater sense of authority, communal worship, communal participation, following authority structures, etc. In Protestantism, there was a more individual interpretation of Christianity. The individual was free to interpret the text as they wish and to make their own choices when it came to their religiosity. And this left the individual slightly on their own in comparison to what was going on in the more Catholic countries. Now, many people have disputed Durkheim's claims, many people have disagreed with his data, and still today we're a bit unsure about the relationship between religiosity and suicide. But the basic point stands that culture can influence this very personal, individual decision of the individual to commit suicide. This is something which culture can influence, and I think Durkheim taught us this. And now today, as sociologists, we examine all the different ways that society can influence us on this very deep level. We might think about how societies can influence our sexualities, the things we find interesting and exciting. The people we fall in love with is very much determined by our cultural norms around things like romance. Okay, we get these ideas from Durkheim. Let me talk about a few other Durkheimian concepts. I think one really interesting one is the concept of anomie. So anomie for Durkheim is a state where the individual does not feel connected to society. Anomie occurs from both too much and too little social integration. If there's too much social integration, the individual is not free to do their own thing. They have to do exactly what the culture expects of them. Right? They have exactly the same religion, values, practices, and customs than everybody else. This can be oppressive and stifling for the individual. And this can lead to a feeling of anomie. The individual might feel that their values are not the same values as are held by the people around them. Anomie can also result from the opposite, too little social integration. In a very individualistic culture where everybody just does what they want, where we have no common ideas about what is moral and right and good, then the individual might feel lost. Again, the same problem occurs. They feel like their values are not the values of those around them. So Durkheim thinks anomie is a negative thing. He thinks it is a mismatch between what the individual believes and what societies believe. And he thinks this can be a very negative emotional feeling. It can lead to withdrawal, it can lead to suicide, it can also lead to violence. This often occurs when societies change very quickly and the kind of values and ideas that people were socialized into are no longer values they see represented in the culture. Think about young people today who might have been socialized to expect that they could buy a house, for example, and are now facing an economic situation where that's increasingly more difficult. I think about these young incel men, for example, who are, they feel that they've been cut out of the possibility of having a romantic relationship. They were socialized to believe that they would get a girlfriend, a wife perhaps, maybe one day a family. They feel that they're unable to obtain that, and often they become very resentful and violent. They turn against society because of this very strong feeling of anomie. And we've seen cases of incel mass shootings and terrorism and things of that nature, which shows you how violent anime can be, how destructive it can be. I thought another good example of this is this Japanese phenomenon of the hikikomori. And these are individuals, like the individual pictured here, who have simply dropped out of society. They often live in very small apartments, they might still live with their parents, they barely ever leave these apartments, they might get most of their food delivered, they seem to spend most of their time playing video games or reading manga, things like that. And it seems like these individuals have no feeling of commitment to society. They don't want to participate in society. They've almost entirely dropped out of society. This is because of anime. Right? They no longer feel like they have anything to offer society. They don't feel like their goals are the goals of society. So anime, you can see, is a very useful concept, a very flexible concept that I believe is really quite important for understanding many contemporary social phenomena. A couple of final things to say about Durkheim. We're talking about social integration. That is the question of what keeps the individual committed to society. What are the mechanisms that hold society together and prevent things like violence and terrorism, or prevent things like the hikikomori? Now, when Durkheim tried to answer this question, his belief was that there was not a universal answer. There is not one mechanism that holds society together. There are different mechanisms, and they varied throughout human history. So he tries to chart the course of changes in the mechanisms of social integration. Now, Durkheim gives us a very famous distinction when he does this. It's the distinction between mechanical solidarity on the one hand and organic solidarity on the other. And these terms can be a little bit confusing, so let's take our time and explain them. When Durkheim looks at the early human societies, small hunter-gatherer societies for example, he thinks they are united by what he calls mechanical solidarity. Now, mechanical solidarity is a form of integration that is based upon every person being basically identical. People share the same actions, attitudes, and values, the same religions, the same customs, the same culture, and that knits them together as a group, in the same way that a family might feel united by ties of blood, for example. This can be confusing because it's called mechanical solidarity, and the word mechanical might make you think of modern societies with machines, but it's his word for earlier societies, and the word mechanical here conveys similarity, uniformity. Now, Durkheim believes that as societies get bigger and more complex, mechanical solidarity starts to recede. And what replaces it is instead organic solidarity. Organic solidarity is a metaphor based upon the human body, or based upon an organism. In an organism we have various parts, and those parts are dependent on one another. Right, if I cut my arm off, that arm cannot survive outside of my body. If I cut my head off, my head's not going to survive without my body. They're interdependent on one another. And Durkheim thinks this is what is happening in contemporary societies. Why are we committed to society? Why do we hang together? It's because we couldn't survive outside of one another. In earlier hunter-gatherer societies, societies are constantly breaking apart. Many families, for example, will simply break off from society because it's not very difficult for a hunter-gatherer to simply live on their own. Today, most of us would feel terrified if we have to live on our own. We have developed a very high division of labour, where instead of providing for all of our needs, we rely on hundreds of other people, millions of other people, to provide the necessary resources we need to survive. We are highly interconnected, highly independent. That's organic solidarity, and for Durkheim, that's what unites us in modern societies. Now, Durkheim believed that organic solidarity was the form of integration characteristic of modern societies, but he believed that we still needed some degree of mechanical solidarity. Division of labour was not enough. We did have to have something in common to hang together. And he believed there was something we have in common, something to do with our culture, our values, etc. Durkheim thought without that, society would inevitably break apart. There would inevitably be conflict and violence and war and chaos, etc. We'll talk a bit more about this in the next part, but many future theorists have tried to take up this idea and ask the question of what actually holds society together anymore. Do we share anything in common? Do we as Australians, for example, have some common ideas or values or culture? One thing that Durkheim suggested is maybe what unites us is actually a shared belief in what he called the cult of the individual. Maybe we all believe in certain ideas about democracy and human rights and the rule of law and the freedom and the welfare of the individual. And maybe that is what unites us as a polity. Very interesting questions you can ask here. I look at many societies around the world that seem very fragmented, and I often ask the question, is there anything these people have in common anymore? And if not, what is actually holding them together? When we ask questions like that, we're thinking in a Durkheimian mold. So what are some of the key ideas we get from Durkheim? Remember, Durkheim, like Marx, like Spencer, like Comte, is very strong positivist. He believes in the importance of scientific methods. He also believes that social order is a problem that societies must solve. Right? Societies are constantly under threat. They're constantly under threat of breaking apart. There needs to be mechanisms that hold society together, either mechanical or organic. And he examined all the different kind of mechanisms that have evolved through human history to do that. There's also a strong sense in Durkheim that human behavior is driven by social forces and social structures, that our behavior is mostly determined by social forces. He agrees with Marx on this. Right? He believes that most of human behavior is driven by forces outside of our control. And in fact, for Durkheim, that's why we need sociology. If we understood why we were behaving the way that we were behaving, if our action was fully conscious to us, why do we need some sociological expert to come and tell us why we behave the way we do? For Durkheim, the whole point is that we don't know why we behave the way we do. We're unsure about our behavior and our action. And we need a sociologist to unveil the world to us. In the same way that the physicist would come and explain gravity to us, a sociologist would come and explain the laws which govern and determine the way we behave. A very influential idea, a very controversial idea, I might say, and something we can discuss further in the classes or online. Okay, that's all for this part. There's a lot there. Take a break, take a deep breath, come back, and we'll talk about social theory today.